Welcome back, my friend. The lamps are lit, the wind has quieted, and somewhere in the shadows the Niffler has found something shiny again. But this time, it's not gold. It's a story. And tonight, he's ready to share it with you. So settle in and listen closely. It begins like this.
The library of Hogwarts in the deep hours before dawn was a cathedral of whispered secrets and forgotten dreams. Dust motes danced in the pale silver light that filtered through the tall Gothic windows, each particle catching the moonbeams like tiny stars suspended in the vast silence. The air itself seemed thick with the weight of centuries, old parchment and aged leather, the faint sweetness of dried ink, and that peculiar mustiness that speaks of knowledge preserved through countless seasons. Tobias Hartwell sat hunched over a corner table in the deepest recesses of the library, surrounded by an archipelago of opened books, scattered quills, and half-finished maps. His dark hair fell across his forehead in unruly waves, and his fingers were permanently stained with various colored inks. Indigo from charting the Whomping Willow's emotional radius, amber from mapping the contentment that pooled around the kitchen hearths, and deep crimson from tracking the passionate arguments that echoed through the Gryffindor common room. At 17, Tobias was a Ravenclaw whose particular genius lay not in solving ancient riddles or deciphering forgotten runes, but in something far more subtle and profound. He could see emotions as geography. Where others saw stone corridors and empty classrooms, Tobias perceived landscapes of feeling, rolling hills of contentment, deep valleys of sorrow, sudden cliffs of excitement that dropped away into pools of nervous anticipation. His specialty was map-making, but not the ordinary kind that showed staircases and secret passages. Tobias created emotional cartography, charts that revealed the hidden emotional topology of Hogwarts itself. Each map was a masterpiece of delicate lines and careful shading, showing not just where things were, but how they felt to be there. The table before him was crowded with his latest work, a comprehensive emotional survey of the Great Hall during different times of day. Morning brought soft yellows and pale golds, the gentle awakening of hundreds of sleepy students. Noon blazed with bright oranges and energetic reds, laughter and animated conversation flowing like warm rivers between the house tables. But evening painted itself in deeper hues, purples and midnight blues swirled with threads of homesickness, exhaustion, and the quiet satisfaction of another day survived. But tonight, Tobias wasn't working on his own maps. Instead, he was bent over something far more precious and mysterious, a piece of parchment so old it seemed to exhale history with every breath of air that passed over it. The parchment was rough beneath his fingertips, its edges brown and brittle with age, and across its surface stretched the most extraordinary map he had ever encountered. It was unfinished. That much was immediately clear. Lines trailed off into nothing, as if the map maker had been interrupted mid-stroke. Whole sections remained blank, waiting for a hand that would never return to complete them. But what had been finished was breathtaking. The map showed Hogwarts, but not as any architectural survey could capture it. This was Hogwarts as a living, breathing entity of pure emotion. Each corridor pulsed with color. Here a warm amber glow where students often gathered to share secrets. There a cool blue wash where lonely souls came to think in solitude. The great hall blazed like an aurora of intermingled feelings, while the dungeons showed deep purples and midnight blues, not of evil, but of introspection and hidden depths. But most remarkable of all were the moving elements. Like the Marauder's map that legend whispered about, this chart showed people, but not as names or footprints. Instead, it displayed them as glowing points of emotional energy, each person a small star of feeling that moved through the castle's emotional landscape, leaving trails of light that faded slowly, like the afterimage of a bright spell cast in darkness. Tobias had discovered the map 3 nights ago, tucked away in a forgotten alcove behind a section of books on medieval cartography that no one had disturbed in decades. He'd been researching techniques for his own emotional mapping when his fingers had brushed against something hidden behind a particularly large volume on geographical divination in the 15th century. The parchment had been wrapped in oiled cloth, protected but not hidden with any particular care, as if someone had simply set it aside and forgotten it existed. Now, as the castle slept around him, Tobias found himself drawn back to this mystery night after night. The map called to him in ways he couldn't explain, its unfinished state speaking to something deep in his cartographer's soul. Every line begged for completion, every blank space whispered of stories yet to be told. He traced one of the map's delicate lines with his fingertip, feeling the slight roughness where the ink had dried and cracked with age. The line led from the great hall toward what should have been the Gryffindor Tower, but it stopped abruptly halfway up, as if the mapmaker had simply vanished mid-thought. "What were you trying to show?" Tobias whispered to the empty library, his voice barely disturbing the dust motes that continued their eternal dance in the moonlight. "What did you see that needed to be preserved?" As if in answer to his question, the map suddenly shimmered. For just a moment, so brief he might have imagined it, the incomplete lines seemed to pulse with a faint golden light. The moving points of emotion flickered more brightly, and Tobias could swear he saw new trails of light beginning to form, as if the map was trying to complete itself. He leaned closer, his heart racing with excitement and something deeper, a sense of connection, of recognition. This wasn't just an abandoned project. This was something living, something that had been waiting. "You want to be finished," he breathed, understanding flooding through him like warm honey. "You've been waiting for someone who could see what you see." The realization hit him with the force of a perfectly cast cheering charm. This map hadn't been abandoned, it had been interrupted. And whatever had stopped its original creator was still present in its incomplete state, a mystery written in blank spaces and trailing lines. Tobias pulled out his finest quill, a phoenix feather that responded to the subtlest emotional nuances, and dipped it in his special ink, a mixture he'd developed himself that captured not just lines and shapes, but feelings and intentions. The ink seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight, ready to bridge the gap between past and present, between one mapmaker's vision and another's skill. But as he poised the quill over the ancient parchment, ready to attempt his first addition to the mysterious map, something strange happened. The existing lines began to shift and move, rearranging themselves slowly but deliberately. What had been a partially complete corridor suddenly extended itself, flowing across the blank parchment like spilled mercury. New chambers appeared, rooms that Tobias had never seen in all his years at Hogwarts, spaces that seemed to exist in the emotional geography of the castle, but not in its physical reality. And in these new spaces, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Dark spots were appearing on the map, not the rich, deep colors of sadness or contemplation, but true darkness. Voids where emotion should have been. Empty spaces that seemed to drink in the surrounding light and feeling, leaving nothing but hollow silence. These dark spots weren't natural. They moved with purpose, spreading slowly but inexorably across the emotional landscape of the castle like some sort of infection. And as Tobias watched in growing alarm, he realized that wherever these dark voids passed, the normal emotional patterns of the castle were disrupted. Laughter died away into nervous silence. Contentment curdled into unease. Even the deepest friendships seemed to grow strained and distant. Someone, or something, was stealing the emotions from Hogwarts itself. And this ancient, unfinished map was the only thing that could see it happening. Tobias set down his quill with a trembling hand, his mind racing. This wasn't just a historical curiosity anymore. This was a window into a mystery that was unfolding right now, in his time, affecting his fellow students in ways they couldn't even perceive. The map had shown itself to him because it needed him, not just to complete its cartography, but to solve the terrible puzzle that had been growing in the shadows of the castle's emotional landscape. The library suddenly felt colder, the shadows deeper. Tobias gathered up the precious map, wrapping it carefully in his own cloak, and began collecting his materials. He would need to study this more carefully, away from the echoing vastness of the library, where every whisper seemed to carry farther than it should. As he stood to leave, the map pulsed once more against his chest, and for a moment he felt a strange doubling of sensation, as if he was seeing the library not just with his own eyes, but through the map's ancient perspective. He saw the warm amber glow of his own dedication and curiosity, the pale blue wash of his concern for his fellow students, and threading through it all, a thin line of golden determination that seemed to connect him directly to the map itself. But he also saw something else, a dark tendril, barely visible, creeping along the edge of his perception. It was moving through the library's emotional landscape, questing, searching, and it was moving toward him. Tobias didn't wait to see more. Clutching the wrapped map to his chest like a precious secret, he slipped between the towering bookshelves and made his way toward the library's exit. Behind him, the darkness seemed to press closer, as if something had noticed his discovery and didn't approve. The corridors of Hogwarts at night were painted in shades of silver and deep blue, lit by the gentle glow of floating candles that never seemed to burn down completely. Tobias moved through these familiar passages with the careful stealth of someone who had spent years learning the castle's nocturnal rhythms. He knew which stones creaked underfoot, which corners held the deepest shadows, and which routes would take him back to Ravenclaw Tower without encountering any of the prowling prefects or ever-vigilant portraits. But tonight, the castle felt different. The emotional landscape that Tobias could always sense, that constant background hum of feeling that permeated every stone and surface, seemed muted somehow, dampened, as if someone had thrown a heavy blanket over the castle's usual emotional symphony, leaving only the faintest echoes of what should have been a rich and complex chorus of human feeling. It was wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong, and now that Tobias knew to look for it, he could see the evidence everywhere. A group of first-year Hufflepuffs who should have been radiating the warm contentment of new friendships instead seemed listless, distracted. A pair of fifth-year Ravenclaws who usually sparked with the bright energy of intellectual debate now walked past each other, without even a nod of recognition. The dark voids on the ancient map weren't just marking empty spaces, they were marking stolen spaces. Places where the natural emotional resonance of the castle had been drained away, leaving behind a hollow echo of what should have been vibrant human connection. By the time Tobias reached his dormitory, his mind was churning with questions and possibilities. His roommates were long asleep, their breathing creating a gentle rhythm in the darkness, and Tobias was grateful for the solitude. He needed time to think, to plan, to figure out how to use this incredible discovery to help his fellow students, many of whom probably didn't even realize something was being taken from them. He carefully unrolled the ancient map on his desk, weighing down the corners with books and inkwells. In the soft candlelight of his dormitory, the map seemed even more mysterious, its completed sections glowing with an inner light while the blank spaces seemed to absorb and hold the darkness. As Tobias studied the map more closely, he began to notice patterns in the emotional cartography. The dark voids didn't appear randomly, they followed specific routes through the castle, connecting certain chambers and corridors in a web that seemed almost intentional. As if someone who understood the castle's emotional geography was deliberately targeting the places where feelings ran deepest and strongest. The Great Hall, with its constant flow of laughter and conversation. The common rooms, where the bonds of friendship were forged and strengthened. The classrooms where students experienced the thrill of discovery and the satisfaction of mastery. Even the quiet corners where lonely students came to find peace. All of these places showed signs of the creeping darkness, though in different degrees. But most disturbing of all, Tobias noticed that the pattern of dark voids seemed to be converging on a single point deep in the castle, a location that the map marked with a symbol he didn't recognize, something that looked like a knot of twisted lines that hurt to look at directly. Whatever was stealing the emotions from Hogwarts, it was building toward something, gathering the stolen feelings for some purpose that Tobias couldn't yet fathom, but which filled him with a cold dread that settled in his stomach like a stone. He would need help. This was too big, too complex for one student to handle alone. But who could he trust with something so strange, so unprecedented? Most of his fellow students wouldn't believe him. Emotional cartography was obscure enough that few people understood what he was talking about even under normal circumstances. And the professors, well, they had their own responsibilities, their own understanding of how the castle worked. Would they be able to see what the map was showing him? As dawn approached, painting the eastern windows of the dormitory with pale gold light, Tobias made his decision. He would start small, carefully. He would document what he was seeing, create his own maps to complement the ancient one, and build a case that no one could ignore. And he would begin his investigation by visiting the places on the map where the emotional disturbances were strongest, starting with that mysterious convergence point deep in the castle's heart. The map pulsed gently under his fingertips, as if approving of his plan. For the first time since he'd discovered it, Tobias smiled. He was no longer just a student studying emotional cartography. He was a detective, a guardian, a protector of the very feelings that made Hogwarts feel like home. The real adventure was just beginning. The next evening found Tobias in a place he had never expected to conduct magical research, the abandoned classroom on the third floor that smelled perpetually of stale cauldron smoke and forgotten ambitions. He had chosen this location carefully, guided by the ancient map's subtle suggestions. According to its emotional cartography, this room sat at the intersection of several important feeling currents that flowed through the castle, making it an ideal observatory for his investigation. The map lay spread across 3 pushed-together desks, its surface illuminated by a constellation of floating candles that Tobias had charmed to burn with different colored flames. Each hue corresponded to a different emotional frequency he was tracking: warm amber for contentment, cool silver for contemplation, deep crimson for passion, and a troubling new addition: pale, sickly green flames that flickered whenever the dark voids pulsed with activity. Tobias had spent the day in careful preparation. His school bag now contained an arsenal of specialized cartographic tools: emotion-sensitive inks that changed color based on the feelings they absorbed, quills enchanted to respond to the subtlest shifts in atmospheric mood, and several pieces of fresh parchment that he had treated with a solution of his own devising, powdered moonstone mixed with essence of dittany, which made the paper remarkably receptive to emotional impressions. But most importantly, he had spent hours studying the ancient map, learning to read its complex symbolic language. The original mapmaker had developed an intricate system of notation that went far beyond simple emotional color coding. Delicate spirals indicated areas where feelings moved in circular patterns, usually around places of gathering like the Great Hall or common rooms. Jagged lines marked emotional turbulence, while smooth, flowing curves showed the peaceful pathways where contentment moved like gentle streams through the castle's stone corridors. And everywhere, growing more prominent each time he looked, were those disturbing dark voids that seemed to drink in the surrounding emotional light. "Show me where you're strongest tonight," Tobias whispered to the map, running his finger along its surface in the same gesture he might use to coax a shy creature from hiding. The parchment responded immediately, several areas beginning to glow with increased intensity. The Gryffindor common room blazed with its usual warm reds and golds, but even there, Tobias could see thin tendrils of darkness creeping along the edges, like frost forming on a window in winter. The Hufflepuff common room, normally a beacon of steady yellow contentment, showed patches of unsettling emptiness, spaces where the emotional warmth simply wasn't. But it was the area near the kitchens that made Tobias's breath catch in his throat. The map showed a massive dark void there, larger than any he had seen before, and it was growing. As he watched, the darkness seemed to pulse with a rhythm all its own, expanding and contracting like some sort of terrible heartbeat. "That's where I need to go," he murmured, already reaching for his cloak. The kitchens were familiar territory. He had often visited the house elves there during his emotional mapping projects, documenting the unique patterns of joy and purpose that characterized their work. If something was affecting that warm, welcoming space, then the situation was more serious than he had imagined. The journey through the castle's nighttime corridors felt different now that Tobias understood what he was looking for. Every shadow seemed potentially significant. Every cold draft might indicate an emotional void nearby. He moved carefully, consulting a small hand-drawn map that showed the current positions of the dark spots, updating his route whenever the ancient map indicated that one of the voids had shifted position. The castle after midnight was a realm unto itself. The moving staircases settled into their most comfortable positions, no longer needing to accommodate the constant traffic of students and professors. The portraits dozed in their frames, occasionally murmuring in their sleep. Even the ghosts seemed more substantial in the deep hours, as if the reduced emotional activity of the living world allowed them to draw more fully on whatever energy sustained their existence. But tonight, even the ghosts seemed subdued. Tobias passed, nearly headless, Nick floating listlessly near a window, staring out at the grounds with an expression of vague confusion. The Bloody Baron drifted through a wall without his usual dramatic flourish, moving with the mechanical precision of someone going through familiar motions without really understanding why. The corridor leading to the kitchens should have been warm with the lingering emotional residue of hundreds of satisfying meals and cheerful conversations. Instead, it felt hollow, echoing not just with footsteps, but with a strange emotional absence that made Tobias's skin crawl. The very stones seemed to have forgotten how to hold the memory of happiness. He paused before the portrait of the bowl of fruit that concealed the kitchen entrance, hesitating. The painting looked normal enough, the same cheerful pears and apples that had smiled at students for generations. But something about their expressions seemed forced, as if they were working harder than usual to maintain their usual sunny dispositions. "Good evening," Tobias whispered to the painted fruit, tickling the pear in the traditional manner. The pear giggled, but the sound was thinner than usual, lacking its normal infectious joy. The kitchen beyond was a revelation of wrongness. Tobias had visited this space dozens of times during his emotional mapping projects, and it had always been one of the brightest places in the entire castle from an emotional perspective. House elves took profound satisfaction in their work, creating layers upon layers of contentment, purpose, and simple happiness that built up over decades into something almost tangible. The kitchen should have glowed like a second sun in the castle's emotional geography. Instead, he found a space that felt hollow, drained, almost lifeless. The house elves were still there, still working with their usual efficiency, but something fundamental had changed. They moved through their tasks with mechanical precision, without the usual chatter and cheerful banter that normally filled the space. Winky arranged pastries with perfect technique, but no obvious pleasure. Dobby, who had joined the Hogwarts staff in recent years, polished silver with the same meticulous care as always, but his large eyes were distant, unfocused. "Good evening," Tobias said softly, not wanting to startle anyone. Several house elves looked up at him, but their usual enthusiastic greetings were replaced by polite, empty acknowledgments. It was as if someone had carefully removed just the emotional color from their responses, while leaving the basic social functions intact. "Is young master needing something?" asked Winky, her voice perfectly correct but somehow flat. "I was wondering if everything has been normal lately," Tobias said carefully. "Have you noticed anything unusual? Any changes in the castle?" The house elves exchanged glances, but not the quick, knowing looks that usually passed between them during conversation. These were slower, more confused, as if they were trying to remember something that kept sliding away from their minds. "Changes?" repeated Dobby, tilting his head with genuine puzzlement. Dobby is not remembering any changes. Everything is being the same as always. But even as he spoke, Dobby's hands moved restlessly, as if some part of him remembered that touching things used to bring more satisfaction than it did now. His fingers traced the edge of a copper pot with the ghost of affection, like someone trying to recall the words to a half-forgotten song. Tobias pulled out a small notebook and made careful observations, documenting not just what he saw but what he felt. The kitchen's emotional signature was still there, but it was like looking at a faded painting, all the right colors in all the right places, but drained of vibrancy and life. Whatever was stealing emotions from the castle was sophisticated enough to leave the basic functions intact while extracting the joy that made those functions meaningful. "Have you been sleeping well?" he asked, trying a different approach. This question produced the first genuine reactions he had seen. Several house elves looked troubled, exchanging more animated glances. "Sleep is being strange," admitted Creature, who worked the night shift and rarely spoke to students. "Creature is having dreams that are not feeling like Creature's dreams." "What kind of dreams?" Tobias pressed gently. "Dreams of emptiness," Winky said slowly, her brow furrowed with the effort of remembering. "Dreams of being hollow inside, like a bottle with all the water poured out. But when Winky is waking up, she is not remembering why the dreams are making her sad. She is only remembering that she was sad, but not knowing what the sadness was about." This was exactly the kind of evidence Tobias had been hoping to find, though it chilled him to hear it. The emotional theft wasn't just affecting people while they were awake. It was reaching into their dreams, their subconscious minds, extracting feeling even from the spaces where the soul was supposed to rest and restore itself. He thanked the house elves and made his way back toward the corridor, his mind racing with new questions. If the theft was affecting dreams, then whatever was doing this had access to the deepest levels of consciousness. This wasn't just some magical creature feeding on ambient emotion. This was something with intelligence, purpose, and a sophisticated understanding of how feelings worked. The ancient map, when he consulted it, confirmed his growing fears. The dark void around the kitchens had grown larger while he had been inside, and new tendrils of darkness were spreading outward, following the pathways that the stolen emotions would have taken as they flowed through the castle's emotional ecosystem. But there was something else. As Tobias studied the map more closely, he began to notice a pattern in the way the dark voids moved. They weren't expanding randomly. They were following specific routes, converging on particular locations. And those locations, when he cross-referenced them with his own emotional maps of the castle, were all places associated with strong positive feelings. The library alcoves where students fell in love with knowledge, the common room corners where deep friendships were forged, the classroom spaces where the joy of discovery burned brightest. Whatever was doing this wasn't just stealing emotions, it was harvesting them, collecting the strongest, most positive feelings from throughout the castle and channeling them toward something. The convergence point on the map, that twisted knot of lines deep in the castle's heart, pulsed with a darker energy now. And as Tobias watched, he could see thin streams of stolen emotion flowing toward it like tributaries feeding a river. A river of harvested joy, contentment, love, and wonder, all flowing toward some central purpose that he couldn't yet understand. His investigation had moved beyond simple curiosity. This was a threat to the very essence of what made Hogwarts special, the accumulated emotional resonance of generations of students who had found magic, friendship, and purpose within these walls. And if he couldn't find a way to stop it, the castle itself might become nothing more than a beautiful, empty shell. The ancient map seemed to sense his determination. As he rolled it up carefully and prepared to return to his dormitory, the parchment pulsed with warm approval, and for just a moment, Tobias felt a connection to its original creator, another cartographer who had recognized this same threat and tried to document it, only to be stopped before the work could be completed. "I won't let that happen," Tobias whispered to the map, to the memory of its maker, to the sleeping castle around him. "I'll find out what's doing this, and I'll find a way to stop it." The map pulsed once more, and Tobias could have sworn he felt an echo of gratitude, as if somewhere in the magical resonance of the parchment, the original mapmaker was still present, still hoping that someone would finish what they had started. Tomorrow, he would begin mapping the convergence flows more precisely. He would document the patterns, trace the stolen emotions to their destination, and prepare for whatever confrontation awaited him in the twisted heart of the castle's emotional geography. But tonight, as he made his way back through corridors that felt a little less warm, a little less welcoming than they had the night before, Tobias carried with him the weight of a terrible responsibility. He was no longer just a student studying the castle's emotional landscape. He was its guardian, perhaps its only hope of remaining the magical, nurturing place that had welcomed seekers of knowledge and wonder for over 1,000 years. The real investigation was just beginning. 3 nights later, Tobias found himself standing before a door that shouldn't have existed. According to every official map of Hogwarts, every architectural survey and historical record, the corridor he stood in should have ended in a blank wall 20 feet earlier. But the ancient map had guided him here, through a labyrinth of passages that seemed to shift and bend according to the flow of stolen emotions rather than any logical architectural design. The door itself was unremarkable: plain oak panels, iron hinges that had seen better centuries, a simple handle worn smooth by countless hands. But to Tobias's emotion-sensitive perception, it blazed like a beacon. Every stolen feeling from throughout the castle seemed to flow toward this point, streaming through the wood like rivers of light converging on some vast, hidden reservoir. His investigation over the past 3 days had painted an increasingly disturbing picture. The emotional theft was accelerating. What had started as subtle drains on the castle's happiness was becoming a hemorrhage of feeling that left entire corridors emotionally barren. Students moved through their daily routines with mechanical precision, still laughing and talking, but with a hollowness that made Tobias's chest ache to witness. Luna Lovegood had been the first to notice something amiss, approaching him after Charm's class with her characteristic directness. "The Nargles have gone quiet," she had said, perching on the edge of his desk like an inquisitive bird. "They usually whisper about the emotional currents around the castle, but lately they've been confused. As if someone has been stealing the very thing they feed on." Most students would have dismissed Luna's observations as another of her eccentricities, but Tobias understood that her unusual perceptiveness often detected truths that others missed. When she mentioned that her dreams had become empty corridors where feelings used to live, he knew she was experiencing the same effects he'd documented among the house elves. Hermione Granger had provided the next piece of the puzzle, though she hadn't realized it. During a study session in the library, she had made an offhand comment about feeling intellectually sluggish lately, as if the usual joy of discovery had been muted. "It's strange," she had mused. "I can still solve problems and learn new spells, but it feels like reading about food when you're hungry instead of actually tasting it." But it was Neville Longbottom who had given Tobias the most crucial information. They had encountered each other in the greenhouses late one evening, both seeking solitude for their respective projects. Neville had been tending to a particularly sensitive venomous tentacula, but his usually intuitive connection with magical plants seemed strained. "Professor Sprout says my technique is still perfect," Neville had confided, "but the plants aren't responding to me the way they used to. It's as if I'm not feeling the joy of growth anymore, so they can't feel it either. Magic isn't just about technique, is it? It's about the emotion behind it." That conversation had crystallized something important for Tobias. Magical ability wasn't being diminished. People could still cast spells, brew potions, and perform enchantments. But the emotional resonance that made magic truly powerful, truly meaningful, was being systematically harvested. Whoever was doing this understood that the real strength of magic lay not in its mechanical application, but in the feelings that gave it purpose and power. Now, standing before this impossible door, Tobias felt the weight of that realization. The ancient map pressed against his chest like a second heartbeat, its parchment warm with anticipation. Every instinct told him that beyond this threshold lay the answers he sought, and probably the confrontation he dreaded. The door opened at his touch, swinging inward with the whisper-soft silence of well-maintained hinges. Beyond lay a chamber that defied every architectural principle Tobias had ever studied. The room was vast, far larger than the castle's structure should have been able to contain. Its walls curved upward into shadows that seemed to have no ceiling, and the floor was a mosaic of polished stones that reflected light from sources he couldn't identify. But most remarkable of all was what occupied the center of the space. A massive crystalline structure rose from the floor like a twisted tree of pure emotion. Its branches were formed from what looked like crystallized feelings: warm amber happiness, deep blue contemplation, brilliant gold joy, silvery satisfaction. But as Tobias watched in horrified fascination, he could see that the crystal was incomplete. Entire sections were missing, leaving jagged gaps where emotions should have been growing. And around the base of the crystal tree, absorbed in careful, methodical work, stood a figure Tobias recognized with a shock of disbelief. Professor Septimus Vale, who taught ancient runes to 7th years, looked up from his delicate manipulation of a floating stream of crystallized contentment. He was younger than Tobias remembered, or perhaps it was simply that his face was lit with a passionate intensity that made him seem more vital, more alive than he appeared during his typically dry lectures. "Ah," Professor Vale said, his voice carrying a warmth that Tobias had never heard in the classroom. "I wondered when someone would finally follow the emotional currents to their source. Though I must admit, I didn't expect it to be a student." Tobias stood frozen in the doorway, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Professor Vale wasn't some dark creature or malevolent entity. He was a member of the Hogwarts faculty, someone who had taught him to decipher the emotional resonances hidden in ancient runic scripts. "You're stealing emotions from the students," Tobias said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're taking away their joy, their contentment, their ability to truly feel." "Stealing?" Professor Vale looked genuinely surprised, even hurt. "My dear boy, I'm not stealing anything. I'm preserving it, safeguarding the most precious resource the magical world has ever known." He gestured toward the crystal tree with obvious pride. "Do you have any idea how much emotional energy is wasted every day? How many moments of perfect happiness, profound contentment, or pure joy simply dissipate into nothingness because no one thought to capture and preserve them?" As if to demonstrate his point, Professor Vale raised his wand and guided another stream of crystallized emotion toward the tree. This one was a delicate spiral of silver and gold that Tobias recognized as the feeling of intellectual discovery, the precise moment when a student finally understood a complex magical concept. "I've been working on this project for 15 years, Professor Vale continued, his eyes bright with the fervor of absolute conviction. "The eternal resonance, a crystalline matrix capable of storing and amplifying human emotions indefinitely. Imagine it, a repository of the finest feelings humanity can produce, preserved forever, available to be studied, understood, and eventually reproduced." "But you're hurting people," Tobias protested, finding his voice at last. "The students, the house elves, everyone in the castle, you're making them hollow, empty. They can't feel real joy anymore because you've taken it away." Professor Vale waved a dismissive hand. "Temporary side effects, nothing more. The human emotional system is remarkably resilient. New feelings will develop to replace what I've harvested, and in the meantime, I'm ensuring that the most perfect examples of each emotion are preserved for posterity." He moved to another section of the crystal tree, where tendrils of deep purple contemplation were being woven into an intricate lattice structure. "You're an emotional cartographer, Tobias. Surely you can appreciate the scientific value of what I'm accomplishing here. I'm creating the most comprehensive emotional atlas ever conceived, not just mapping feelings, but actually capturing their essence." Tobias felt a chill of recognition. The ancient map against his chest seemed to pulse with warning, and he understood with sudden clarity why it had been abandoned unfinished. Its original creator hadn't been interrupted by circumstance. They had discovered Professor Vale's work and tried to stop it. "The map," he said slowly. "The ancient map I found. Someone else figured out what you were doing, didn't they? They tried to document it, to expose you." Professor Vale's expression darkened for the first time. "Ah yes, Professor Meridian's emotional cartography project. Brilliant work, actually. She was the first person to develop truly accurate emotional mapping techniques. Unfortunately, she completely misunderstood the importance of my research." He turned back to the crystal tree, his movements becoming more agitated. "She wanted to destroy 15 years of careful work, decades of accumulated emotional preservation. She couldn't see beyond her narrow concern for individual temporary discomfort to appreciate the greater good I was serving." "What happened to her?" Tobias asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Nothing dramatic," Professor Vale said with a casual air that somehow made it worse. "A minor modification to her emotional resonance. I simply dampened her capacity for righteous indignation. She found that she no longer felt compelled to interfere with my work. Eventually, she took a position at a school in Bulgaria, where her mapping skills could be put to more constructive use." The casual way he described altering another person's fundamental emotional nature made Tobias's blood run cold. This wasn't just about stealing feelings. Professor Vale was reshaping people's personalities, rewriting their emotional landscapes to suit his purposes. "The convergence point on the map," Tobias said, understanding flooding through him. "You've been drawing all the stolen emotions here to feed into your crystal tree. But what happens when it's complete? What are you planning to do with all that preserved feeling?" Professor Vale's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm, the expression of a teacher delighted to share knowledge with an interested student. "The applications are limitless. Imagine being able to produce perfect happiness on demand, or to study the exact molecular structure of contentment. We could eliminate sadness, anger, fear, all the negative emotions that cause so much human suffering." He gestured toward a section of the crystal tree where darker emotions had been crystallized: deep red anger, black despair, sickly yellow fear. "Even these negative feelings serve a purpose in my collection. By understanding their precise nature, we can develop methods to neutralize them permanently." "But those emotions aren't just random occurrences," Tobias protested. "They're part of being human. Sadness helps us appreciate joy, anger motivates us to fight injustice, fear keeps us safe from danger. You can't just eliminate them without changing what it means to be human." Professor Vale's expression grew impatient. "Naive romantic thinking. Human emotions are chemical reactions, Tobias, patterns of magical energy that can be understood, cataloged, and improved upon. My eternal resonance will allow us to evolve beyond the messy, inefficient emotional systems that evolution has saddled us with." As he spoke, Professor Vale continued his work, guiding streams of stolen emotion into the crystal matrix with practiced precision. Each addition made the tree grow larger, more complex, more beautiful, and more terrifying. Tobias could see that it was nearly complete, lacking only a few key emotional frequencies to achieve whatever perfect resonance Professor Vale was seeking. "How many more students are you going to drain?" Tobias asked. "How many more people are you going to hollow out for your collection?" "Only as many as necessary," Professor Vale replied, not looking up from his work. "The final phase requires the most intense emotions, perfect love, absolute dedication, complete wonder. Those feelings are rare, precious. But once I've harvested them, the eternal resonance will be complete, and the real work can begin." Tobias felt the ancient map grow warm against his chest, and with it came a surge of understanding. Professor Meridian hadn't given up her fight against Professor Vale's work. She had hidden her research, her evidence, her maps where someone else could find them. She had counted on another emotional cartographer eventually discovering the truth and finishing what she had started. "I won't let you complete it," Tobias said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "I'll expose what you're doing. I'll show the other professors, the students, everyone." Professor Vale finally looked up from his work, his expression more sad than angry. "I'm afraid I can't allow that, Tobias. You're an extraordinarily gifted young cartographer, and your emotional resonance is particularly strong. In fact, your dedication to protecting others, your sense of justice, your pure determination, those are exactly the kinds of intense positive emotions I need to complete my work." He raised his wand, and Tobias felt a strange tugging sensation, as if something essential was being drawn out of his chest. The crystal tree began to pulse with increased intensity, its branches reaching toward him like hungry fingers. "Don't resist," Professor Vale said gently. It won't hurt, and you'll have the satisfaction of knowing that your feelings will be preserved forever, perfect and unchanging, in the most beautiful emotional repository ever created. But as the extraction began, Tobias felt the ancient map pulse against his heart, and with it came a flood of borrowed strength, the determination of Professor Meridian, the wisdom of the original mapmaker, the accumulated emotional resonance of everyone who had ever loved Hogwarts enough to fight for it. The real battle was about to begin. The extraction spell hit Tobias like a tide of ice water, but instead of the drowning sensation he expected, he felt something extraordinary happen. The ancient map against his chest blazed with sudden heat, and through its parchment flowed not just his own emotions, but the accumulated feelings of everyone who had ever loved Hogwarts. Centuries of wonder, friendship, discovery, and hope. Professor Vale's confident expression flickered as his spell met unexpected resistance. "Impossible," he murmured, his wand wavering. No student should be able to resist the resonance extraction. But Tobias was no longer just a student. The ancient map had transformed him into something more, a conduit for the castle's entire emotional heritage. He could feel Professor Meridian's determination flowing through him, along with the protective love of countless professors who had dedicated their lives to nurturing young minds, and the fierce loyalty of generations of students who had found their true selves within these walls. "You're right about emotions being energy," Tobias said, his voice steady despite the power coursing through him. "But you fundamentally misunderstand how that energy works." He pulled out his phoenix feather quill and a piece of emotion-sensitive parchment, spreading it on the stone floor even as Professor Vale's extraction spell continued to tug at his consciousness. With swift, precise strokes, Tobias began to draw, not a map of where emotions were, but a map of where they wanted to go. "Emotions aren't meant to be captured and stored," he continued, his quill moving with impossible speed and accuracy. "They're meant to flow, to connect, to transform. You've been treating them like objects when they're actually relationships." Professor Vale's eyes widened as he realized what Tobias was doing. "Stop. You don't understand the delicate balance." "I understand it perfectly," Tobias interrupted. "I'm an emotional cartographer. This is what I do." The map he was creating showed not the castle's physical structure, but its emotional ecosystem. Every pathway that feelings traveled, every connection between hearts and minds, every current of empathy and understanding that made Hogwarts more than just a school. And at the center of it all, he drew Professor Vale's crystal tree, not as it was, but as it could be. Instead of harvesting emotions, Tobias's map showed the crystal structure amplifying and redistributing them. Each stolen feeling would return to its source multiplied, creating cascading waves of enhanced emotional resonance throughout the entire castle. The tree would become not a reservoir, but a fountain, the emotional heart of Hogwarts beating stronger than ever before. "You can't simply reverse 15 years of work," Professor Vale shouted, abandoning his extraction spell and whirling to face Tobias directly. His wand blazed with crimson light as he cast a binding curse aimed at freezing Tobias's drawing hand. "I won't let you destroy everything." Tobias rolled sideways just as the red beam scorched the stone where he had been kneeling. His parchment scattered across the floor, the incomplete map still glowing with potential but dangerously exposed. "Protego," he gasped, throwing up a hasty shield charm as Professor Vale advanced on him. "You think a schoolboy's shield can stop me?" Professor Vale snarled, his usual academic composure completely shattered. "Defendo." The cutting curse sliced through Tobias's shield like paper, forcing him to dive behind one of the crystal tree's massive roots. But as the magical energy struck the crystalline formation, something unexpected happened. The tree absorbed the hostile magic and converted it, sending waves of Professor Vale's own frustrated desperation flowing back toward him. The professor staggered, momentarily overwhelmed by the pure emotional feedback from his own spell. Tobias seized the opportunity, scrambling back to his scattered parchment. His quill moved with desperate speed, adding crucial lines to his emotional redirection map, even as Professor Vale recovered from the magical backlash. "Incarcerus," Professor Vale cast, sending thick ropes spiraling toward Tobias. But the ancient map against Tobias's chest flared with protective warmth, and the ropes dissolved into wisps of golden light that fed directly into his growing diagram. "The map is protecting me," Tobias realized aloud, his confidence growing. Professor Meridian built safeguards into it, protections against anyone trying to stop the completion of her work. Professor Vale's face contorted with rage and desperation. "Then I'll destroy the map itself." Incendio Maxima. A massive gout of flame erupted from his wand, hot enough to melt stone. But instead of consuming the parchment, the fire was absorbed into Tobias's diagram, becoming lines of brilliant orange passion that completed a crucial section of his emotional redirection pattern. The ancient map and his new creation were now resonating together, their combined power growing stronger with each of Professor Vale's increasingly frantic attacks. "Every spell you cast only feeds the solution," Tobias said, putting the finishing touches on his map even as magical energy crackled around them. "Your anger, your desperation, your fear of losing control, it's all becoming part of the emotional flow that will free everyone you've imprisoned." As Tobias completed his map, something remarkable happened. The ancient parchment in his hands began to resonate with his new creation, and both maps started to glow with the same golden light. The original mapmaker's vision and Tobias's solution merged into a single, unified purpose. The crystal tree shuddered as the first wave of redirected emotion struck it. Instead of the controlled, methodical absorption that Professor Vale had carefully orchestrated, the structure was suddenly flooded with raw, unfiltered feeling from every corner of the castle. Joy mixed with sorrow, anger danced with love, fear embraced courage in combinations that Professor Vale's rigid categorization system had never been designed to handle. "The resonance patterns, they're destabilizing," Professor Vale cried, frantically working his wand to try to re-establish control. "You're going to destroy everything." "I'm not destroying it," Tobias said, feeling the truth of his words as he spoke them. "I'm setting it free." The crystal tree began to change. Where before it had grown in careful, controlled patterns dictated by Professor Vale's understanding of how emotions should be organized, it now exploded into wild, organic growth. Branches of crystallized feelings sprouted in impossible directions, creating new pathways for emotional energy to flow. The rigid categories that Professor Vale had imposed, happiness here, sadness there, anger safely contained in its own section, dissolved into a swirling galaxy of interconnected feeling. And from this chaos came something beautiful. The emotions that had been trapped in crystal form began to remember what they truly were, living connections between hearts and minds. They reached out to their sources throughout the castle, not as extractive forces but as completing circuits. Every stolen moment of joy found its way back to the student who had originally felt it, but enhanced and enriched by its journey through the crystalline matrix. In the Gryffindor common room, laughter that had been mechanical and hollow suddenly rang with genuine mirth as friends rediscovered the simple pleasure of each other's company. In the kitchens, house elves paused in their work as waves of satisfaction and purpose washed over them, reminding them why they loved to serve. In dormitories throughout the castle, students sleeping fitfully found their dreams suddenly filled with color and warmth instead of the gray emptiness that had plagued them for weeks. Professor Vale staggered backward as the full implications of what was happening became clear. "You don't understand," he said, his voice breaking with desperation. "Without control, without preservation, all these emotions will just fade away again. They'll be lost forever to entropy and time." "No," Tobias said gently, extending his hand toward his professor. "They'll be lived. That's what emotions are for, not to be preserved like specimens in a museum, but to be experienced, shared, and transformed into something greater than the sum of their parts." The crystal tree was no longer growing, it was dancing. Each branch moved in rhythm with the emotional currents flowing through the castle, creating a living symphony of feeling that resonated through every stone and timber of Hogwarts. The structure had become exactly what Tobias's map had envisioned, not a reservoir, but an amplifier, taking the natural emotional connections between people and strengthening them beyond anything Professor Vale had imagined possible. 15 years of work, Professor Vale whispered, watching his carefully controlled creation transform into something wild and unpredictable. "All my research, my theories about emotional optimization, wasn't wasted," Tobias said, surprising himself with his compassion for the man who had nearly stolen his capacity to feel. "You discovered something incredibly important. You proved that emotions are real, measurable, powerful forces that can be shaped and directed. But the purpose isn't to control them. It's to help them flourish." As if responding to his words, the crystal tree pulsed with a warm, golden light that filled the impossible chamber. Professor Vale stood bathed in that glow, and for the first time in years, Tobias could see genuine emotion on his face. Not the controlled satisfaction of successful research, but raw, unfiltered wonder at the beauty of what emotions could become when they were truly free. I had forgotten," Professor Vale said slowly, tears beginning to flow down his cheeks. I had forgotten what it felt like to simply feel. Without analysis, without categorization, without trying to improve or preserve or control. Just to let emotions be what they are. The extraction spell that had been drawing at Tobias's consciousness finally collapsed completely, replaced by something far more powerful. A wave of gratitude and recognition that flowed from the crystal tree to encompass both the student and his professor. Every emotion that Professor Vale had harvested over the years was returning to him now, not as data to be analyzed, but as experiences to be lived. Tobias helped Professor Vale to his feet, both of them staring in awe at what the crystal tree had become. It was no longer a repository of stolen feelings, but a living monument to the emotional connections that made Hogwarts special. Its branches reached toward every corner of the castle, not to extract but to nurture, creating pathways for empathy and understanding that would strengthen the bonds between all who lived and learned within these walls. "What happens now?" Professor Vale asked, his voice still shaky with the overwhelming experience of feeling everything he had suppressed for so many years. "Now we make sure this never happens again," Tobias said, holding up the ancient map that had made everything possible. "We finish Professor Meridian's work. We create emotional maps that protect instead of exploit, that celebrate instead of capture." He looked around the impossible chamber, already envisioning how it could be transformed. This could be the greatest teaching tool ever created, a place where students could come to understand the true nature of emotions, to see how feelings connect us all. Not to control them, but to honor them. Professor Vale nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "An emotional observatory," he said, "where the art of feeling could be studied not as a science to be mastered, but as a mystery to be celebrated." As they stood together in the dancing light of the crystal tree, Tobias felt the ancient map grow warm one final time against his chest. When he unrolled it, he saw that the blank spaces had finally been filled, not with the locations of emotional voids, but with pathways of connection, currents of empathy, and channels of understanding that flowed throughout the castle like a vast, loving circulatory system. The map was complete at last. And more importantly, so was the emotional heart of Hogwarts, stronger, more vibrant, and more beautiful than ever before. The real magic, Tobias realized, had never been in the capturing or controlling of emotions. It had always been in the simple, profound act of letting them flow freely between hearts that were brave enough to remain open to wonder. 6 months after the night that changed everything, Tobias stood once again in the chamber that had once held Professor Vale's crystal tree, though it looked nothing like the sterile laboratory it had been. The impossible room had been transformed into something that took his breath away every time he entered. The Hogwarts Emotional Observatory, a place where the art of feeling had become a subject worthy of study, celebration, and profound respect. The crystal tree still dominated the center of the space, but it had grown beyond anything Professor Vale could have imagined. Its branches now reached every corner of the vast chamber, creating a living canopy of crystallized emotion that pulsed gently with the heartbeat of the castle itself. Each branch told a story. Here, the silver-blue contentment of a successful potions lesson. There, the warm gold of friendships deepened through shared adventures. Everywhere, the countless tiny sparks of wonder that marked moments when magic truly came alive for a student experiencing it for the first time. "It's extraordinary, isn't it?" Professor McGonagall said, joining Tobias at the observation platform that now surrounded the tree. "To think that all of this was here, flowing through our castle for centuries, and we never truly saw it." Tobias nodded, watching a group of third-year students move carefully through the chamber, their faces lit with awe as they observed the emotional currents that connected them to each other and to the ancient stones around them. The observatory had become more than just a teaching tool. It was a reminder of why magic mattered, of the human connections that gave spells their true power. "Professor Vale seems different," one of the students whispered to her friend, gesturing toward where their former ancient runes professor was helping a young Hufflepuff understand the delicate interplay between fear and courage in a crystalline formation near the tree's base. She was right. Septimus Vale bore little resemblance to the cold, analytical teacher who had once lectured on runic theory with mechanical precision. The man who had spent 15 years trying to perfect and preserve emotions had discovered something infinitely more valuable: the simple joy of experiencing them without trying to improve them. His classes had become legendary among students, not for their academic rigor, but for the way he helped them understand that magic without emotion was merely technique, while magic infused with genuine feeling became something transcendent. He asked me yesterday if I thought Professor Meridian would approve of what we've done here, Tobias told Professor McGonagall. I think she would. The letter she left behind, the one hidden with the original maps, suggested that she always believed emotions were meant to be shared, not hoarded. The letter had been Professor Meridian's final gift to whoever might eventually finish her work. Written in the same careful hand that had created the ancient emotional maps, it contained not accusations or warnings, but a vision of what Hogwarts could become if its emotional ecosystem was properly understood and nurtured. Her words had guided the transformation of Professor Vale's extraction chamber into something beautiful, educational, and deeply healing. And what about you, Mr. Hartwell? Professor McGonagall asked with the hint of a smile. How has our young cartographer changed through all of this? Tobias considered the question as he watched the emotional currents flow through the crystal tree's branches. 6 months ago, he had been a solitary student, brilliant at mapping emotions, but somehow separate from the very feelings he studied. The adventure had changed that fundamental distance, teaching him that the most important discoveries came not from observing emotions, but from allowing himself to be fully present within them. I used to think that understanding emotions meant being able to chart them, categorize them, predict their movements, he said slowly. But I've learned that true understanding comes from letting them change you, from allowing yourself to be transformed by the connections you discover. It was true. The shy, academically focused Ravenclaw, who had first discovered the ancient map, had evolved into something he never expected. A teacher, a guide, a bridge between the analytical study of emotions and their lived experience. Students now sought him out not just for help with their emotional mapping assignments, but for conversations about the feelings they were experiencing, the connections they were forming, the wonder they were discovering in the magical world around them. The observatory has helped more than just our current students, Professor McGonagall observed. Professor Flitwick mentioned that even some of our alumni have requested visits, seeking to understand emotions they've carried for years but never quite comprehended. That had been one of the most unexpected developments. Word of the emotional observatory had spread beyond Hogwarts, drawing visitors from across the wizarding world. Former students returned to explore feelings they had experienced during their school years, but never fully processed. Parents came seeking to understand the emotional landscapes their children were navigating. Even researchers from other magical institutions had begun collaborative projects, studying how emotional awareness could enhance magical education. But perhaps most importantly, the observatory had become a place of healing. Students who had lost their way, who felt disconnected from magic or from each other, could come here and see the invisible threads that bound them to the larger community. The crystal tree didn't just display emotions. It revealed the fundamental truth that no one was truly alone, that every feeling was part of a vast, interconnected web of human experience. There's something I wanted to discuss with you, Professor McGonagall said, her tone becoming more formal. The ministry has been asking questions about our new approach to emotional education. Some officials are concerned that we're encouraging students to be too open with their feelings. Tobias felt a familiar surge of protective anger, but it was tempered now by deeper understanding. They're afraid, he said, just like Professor Vale was afraid. They want to control emotions because they don't understand that true strength comes from embracing them, not suppressing them. Precisely, which is why I've recommended to the Hogwarts Board of Governors that we create a new position, Professor of Emotional Cartography and Student Wellness. Someone who could help other magical institutions understand what we've learned here, while continuing to develop our own programs. The implication hit Tobias like a gentle cheering charm. You're offering me a permanent position? But I'm not even finished with my education yet. Your education in traditional subjects, perhaps, Professor McGonagall said with a knowing look. But you've already completed a course of study that no textbook could provide. You've learned to read the human heart, to understand the connections that make magic meaningful, and to help others discover those same truths. Those are the qualifications that matter most for this particular role. As if to underscore her point, a group of first-year students approached the observation platform, their faces bright with excitement. Tobias, called a young Gryffindor named Sarah. Could you show us again how friendship looks different from the tree's perspective? Marcus thinks it's just yellow light, but Emma says she can see silver threads connecting people's hearts. You're both right, Tobias said, kneeling to their eye level and pointing toward a section of the crystal tree where several emotional currents were interweaving. Marcus, you're seeing the joy that friends feel when they're together, that warm, golden glow that makes everything seem brighter. Emma, you're seeing the deeper connections, the silver threads that link hearts even when friends are apart, the bonds that grow stronger through shared experiences. The children stared in wonder as Tobias guided their attention to different aspects of the emotional display. The beautiful thing about friendship, he continued, is that it's both things at once. The immediate happiness of being together, and the lasting connection that continues even when you're separated. The tree shows us both layers because both are equally real and important. Will we be able to see emotions like you do someday? Marcus asked, his eyes wide with possibility. You already do, Tobias assured him. Every time you know instinctively that someone is sad and needs comfort, every time you feel your heart lift when you see a friend smile, every time you sense the mood of a room without anyone saying a word, you're reading emotional currents. The tree just helps you see what you were already feeling. As the children wandered back toward the crystal tree, chattering excitedly about the emotional patterns they were learning to recognize, Professor McGonagall placed a gentle hand on Tobias's shoulder. That, she said, is exactly why you're the right person for this position. You don't just understand emotions, you help others discover their own emotional wisdom. Tobias looked around the observatory, taking in the sight of students, professors, and visitors all moving through the space with a sense of wonder and connection that would have been impossible to imagine 6 months ago. The crystal tree pulsed gently at the center of it all, no longer a tool for extraction and control, but a living symbol of the emotional bonds that made Hogwarts more than just a school. I accept, he said simply. But I have one condition. Professor McGonagall raised an eyebrow. Professor Vale should be my co-professor, Tobias continued. He understands the technical aspects of emotional magic better than anyone, and his journey from control to connection makes him the perfect person to help students who might be tempted to use emotions as tools rather than embracing them as experiences. An excellent suggestion, Professor McGonagall agreed. I believe Professor Vale would be honored by the opportunity to redeem his earlier work through service to future generations. As the day drew toward evening, Tobias found himself alone in the observatory with the crystal tree, just as he had been alone in the library with the ancient map all those months ago. But this solitude felt entirely different, not the isolation of a scholar separated from his subject, but the peaceful connection of someone who had found his place in the larger web of human experience. He pulled out the ancient map that had started everything, its parchment now complete and glowing softly with satisfied accomplishment. The map showed not just the emotional geography of Hogwarts, but the living, breathing connections between every heart that had ever found wonder within these walls. It was Professor Meridian's vision finally realized, a complete chart of how feelings moved through the castle, creating the invisible infrastructure that made magic possible. But more than that, it was a testament to the power of collaboration across time. Professor Meridian had planted the seeds with her careful observations and hidden maps. Professor Vale had unknowingly nurtured those seeds with his crystalline research, even as he misunderstood their true purpose. And Tobias had been the gardener who helped them bloom into something beautiful and life-giving. Thank you, he whispered to the map, to Professor Meridian's memory, to the crystal tree, and to the castle itself, for teaching me that the most important magic isn't something we do to the world, it's something we allow the world to do to us. The tree pulsed with warm acknowledgement, and Tobias felt a deep sense of completion settle over him like a comfortable cloak. His journey from isolated scholar to guardian of emotional connections was complete, but it was also just beginning. Tomorrow would bring new students eager to understand the magic of feelings, new challenges to the importance of emotional authenticity, new opportunities to help others discover the profound connections that made life meaningful. Outside the observatory windows, the sun was setting over Hogwarts, painting the ancient stones with shades of gold and crimson that spoke of endings and beginnings intertwined. Students were making their way back to their common rooms, their emotional signatures creating warm trails of contentment and anticipation that fed into the castle's vast circulatory system of feeling. And in the heart of it all, the crystal tree continued its eternal dance, amplifying and celebrating every emotion that flowed through the castle, not capturing them for preservation, but setting them free to create connections, inspire wonder, and remind everyone who encountered them that to feel deeply was to live fully. Tobias smiled as he carefully rolled up the ancient map one final time. Tomorrow he would begin his new role as professor of emotional cartography, but tonight he was simply a young man who had learned that the greatest adventures were not found by conquering the unknown, but by opening one's heart to the extraordinary magic hidden in the simple act of allowing oneself to feel. In the distance, the castle bells began to chime the hour, their bronze voices carrying across the grounds like a lullaby for all who called Hogwarts home. And as their echoes faded into the peaceful darkness, every stone and timber of the ancient castle seemed to sigh with contentment, secure in the knowledge that its emotional heart would beat strong and true for generations yet to come. The mapmaker's apprentice had become the master of his craft, but more importantly, he had become a guardian of the human heart itself. And that, perhaps, was the most magical transformation of all.